Well, hi, Stu Bainman coming to you from Pawleys Island, South Carolina, and we've been looking at miracles that Jesus still works. People with big problems who encounter Jesus, and when they do, their lives are changed. And as we've been looking at these people and these miracles, I want us to understand how Jesus can make a difference in your life and mine today and forever. I remember talking to a woman who took a yearly missionary trip to Africa to work with leper colonies there. And she told me that in the advanced stages of that disease, there's an atrophy where the fingers dry up and they fall off. And so her whole job was to take duct tape and get a spoon or a fork or a knife and tape it to the knob of an arm, a deformed arm. She said these people were beyond a human ability to restore what they had lost. And that's the kind of story we're going to look at in this message. Luke records the story of a man who had a big problem. He had lost the use of his hand. Luke writes in chapter 6, verse 6, "On another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled." Luke has been slowly but surely revealing the identity of Jesus in two ways. Through his teaching, he teaches with exousia, with authority. People were spellbound. They were riveted. They were hanging on every word. And he was revealing his authority and his identity in his miracles, in the dunamis, in the power. He had power over nature, stilling the storm, power over the spiritual world, the demoniac that we looked at, power over the physical world, healing the paralytic, the blind man. And people were amazed and astonished when he would do this, and great crowds gathered. Everyone wanted to see what Jesus was going to say and what he was going to do next. So Luke tells us it's the Sabbath. People are gathered in the synagogue, the gathering place. We've talked about what a synagogue was in this message series. And the local leader, as was custom, would invite a guest speaker to come and teach the people. Well, of course, he's going to invite Jesus because Jesus is in town. And so the people flock to hear what he's going to say, what this teacher has to say to them. Now, there's a man there. I don't know how he got in. Somehow he got in, way in the back, who has a disability. Something's wrong. His right hand is shriveled. It's unusable. And because it is, he's declared unclean. They saw that as a punishment from God. He didn't belong in the synagogue. He's hiding his hand. In biblical times, a disability was a common problem. We don't see it much in our societies today, but in those days, it was everywhere. I remember visiting the Altiplano in La Paz, Bolivia. 2 to 3 million people living in cardboard boxes, this terribly poor section of town. Nothing but third world poverty. And in this place, the Altiplano, there was no medical help. So it was like stepping back in biblical times where people were left uncared for with disease and deformities. They couldn't walk or see or hear. And this man had a deformity that Luke points out to us, and it's not his left hand, which is the hand of personal hygiene in biblical days. It's his right hand, the hand of fellowship, of relationship. And he had lost the use of it. It was shriveled. He had a disability. And I would imagine that many of us can relate to this concept of disability, that there are things in our lives that hold us back from living the way that God created you and me to live, things that bind us up. We can't, they're shriveled, they're disabled. We find ourselves in places like that where we don't know what's happened, but we do know that probably many of us could identify with this man. He was not living the way that God had created him to live because he wasn't able to. He had a disability. Luke writes, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Do you remember in 1975, the movie Jaws, the Steven Spielberg movie? Do you remember that Jaws, that great white shark, was stalking, lurking beneath the surface, ready to attack? That's what I want you to think of when you think of the scribes and the Pharisees. Even think of that music. Dun, 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 dun. The church leaders, the scribes and the Pharisees, are watching him closely. Think of Jaws. They're ready to pounce. So here we have in this synagogue, we find a man with a disability and religious leaders stuck in their religious ways looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. They want to trap him. circle around like vultures waiting for a mistake. Maybe they could even find him violating their Sabbath laws, one of which was to heal on the Sabbath. You see, Jesus is in direct conflict with the religious teachers. They have turned their religion, their Hebrew faith, into an elaborate system of over 600 ceremonial laws, external observances, duties, rules, regulations, all designed to place them in a position of special standing or favor before God. Religion has gotten in the way of a relationship with God. I remember one Sunday after the service, I had finished preaching, and several church members came up to me afterwards, and they said, there was a kid in church today with a baseball hat on, sitting toward the center of the congregation, and it was so disrespectful. He's in a house of worship. And my heart was just crushed. What they didn't know is that after that service, the parents of that young man had come up to me and said, our son has never felt comfortable in church. He's always felt like a misfit. So thank you for accepting him as he was today. Thank you. It's when religion gets in the way of relationship. All they could think about were their own laws. All they could think about were their own laws. All they could see or hope for was Jesus violating their own sacred traditions. Don't mess up the church. And in the process, they messed up the whole work of God. They missed his mercy and his grace and the power of God. They were saying, we know how church should work, and you don't. Luke goes on, but Jesus knew what they were thinking and said to the man with the shriveled hand, get up and stand up in front of everyone. So he got up and stood there. Dr. Luke tells us that Jesus knew what they were thinking. He knows they're trying to set a trap. They're waiting for him to make a mistake. I find this a little unsettling to know that Jesus knows what their thoughts were. And if he knows what their thoughts were, he knows what my thoughts are this very moment. He knows what brought me here, what I'm thinking, what's on my heart, what motivates me, what guides me, what leads me, what directs me. He knows what has power over my life. Kind of an unsettling thought, isn't it? Thank God that he loves us in grace and mercy. Now, in the middle of all that, the man is quietly sitting, watching and listening. And all of a sudden, Jesus stops, looks at the man with a shriveled hand, and said, you get up, stand up in front of everyone now. And the man got up and stood there in front of everyone. I can see him hiding his hand somehow behind his back or in his cloak or whatever, because he doesn't want to be found out. Why me, Jesus? What did I do? And then I see him thinking, I knew I shouldn't have come today. No way. This is way too risky. Then Jesus said to them all, I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or destroy it? Jesus turns from the man and he looks at the people and the scribes and the Pharisees. And he asks them a question, an either-or question. Which is it lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or evil, to save life or destroy it? That's an important question. What's it right to do? To protect our religious turf, our reservation monastic theology, create a little safe place for us to huddle in, our little holy huddle, sanctification by separation, don't get contaminated by sinful people, or extend grace and mercy, the grace and mercy of God to people in need? Which is it? And oh, by the way, the man is still standing there. So he looked around at them all, then said to the man, stretch out your hand. He did so, and his hand was completely restored. But they were furious and began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. Here we find a man with a disability, religious leaders stuck in their own religious ways, and a man who got healed, whose life was restored. Jesus looks around at all of them, everyone, eye to eye. There's a long silence. No one said a word. There was no answer to his question. Then, And only then, after he knew that they were silenced, he looks at the man hiding his hand with everybody watching him, standing there, and he says to him, "Stretch out your hand." And the man took that shriveled, disabled, withered hand, and he did so. He stretched it high. He held up the withered hand, and it was completely restored. Instantly. No waiting, no extended time of recovery or restoration, just a word from Jesus. No other explanation but the direct hand of God. The primary means, remember, of a miracle is to authenticate the message of the miracle doer. And here Jesus is showing his power, that he is sent from God, that he is the Son of God. No other explanation than his word. What a miracle that Jesus worked that day. Now, the scribes and the Pharisees, they're filled with joy and happy. No, they're furious. They didn't rejoice. They were filled with rage. A man's hand was restored, and they were filled with anger. They wanted to destroy Jesus. What a church service. We find a man with a disability, religious leaders stuck in their own religious ways that got angry, and a man who got healed and his life restored. The power of God moved spontaneously and freely. God has the power to restore human life. And I don't know where you find yourself or what you're feeling right now or what's shriveled or withered up in your life. But I can tell you this, God is able to take the broken, that which is lost, that which is disabled, and make it whole. Make it thrive in our lives. As far down as we go, he can take us that high. Don't think we can anticipate in any way what God will do when the Spirit of God shows up. God is present this very moment in your life and in mine. And that Spirit and that power and his word cannot be bound. He knows what we're thinking. I love the unexpected movement of the Spirit of God in our lives. We never know when it might break forth, when it might bring wholeness to broken lives. Here he restores a withered hand and a shriveled heart. Well, a couple questions here to close this out. Where do we put God in a box? In old ways of thinking, hold on to dusty beliefs, hollow formalism like the scribes and the Pharisees. We think we know what should be done. We're in charge around here. How often do we do that in place of real relationship and encountering the real love of God? Which causes me to ask, what do I need to leave behind of what I think the way God is? And what do I need to move forward towards how God really is in his grace and his mercy and his power in my life? Where do I need to bring light into the darkness? Where do I need to open my life up to God to take that which is disabled and not thriving and withered and make it grow? Where is that in your life today? Just name one thing and bring it before God. I know the man didn't ask to be healed, but Jesus knows what he was thinking, and he knows what you're thinking and I'm thinking this very moment. So go ahead and ask him. And secondly, what is it that is withered and needs to be restored? Jesus knows you and me. He knows what we're thinking. He knows what's withered and shriveled and disabled. And he invites us to come and stand before him as we are. I know it's risky, it's uncomfortable, it's life-changing. Stretch out your hand. Do what he tells you to do. What are you trying to say to me? Imagine if that man came into your room this very moment, wherever you are, if your car, your room, or you're outside listening to this, and he said, "Hey, that was me." Yeah. When he tells you to stand up, listen. Stand up. You never know what God might do next. I was having a very, very difficult time in my life, a lot of depression, and nothing was going right. And I remember talking to a very, very close friend of mine after I had been speaking at a church, and he dropped me off at the airport. And he said to me, I don't have a whole lot to pray for you. It seems like you've got a lot of complex problems. I'm just going to ask that God throws every bit of grace at you that he can possibly throw at you. I want God to throw grace your way. And I want God to throw grace at you and me this very moment as we listen to this message. Just let him throw his grace our way. And when we do, when we let him do that, and when we are open and receive that and release to him what we need to release, we will know the miracles that Jesus still works today in your life and mine.